السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم and welcome to another edition of the Maulana Sulaiman Ravat show, where the coverage on the situation in Gaza specifically and Palestine in general continues. Almost 2 months now since the heavy bombardment and the genocide, or this round of the genocide, let's put it that way, commenced in Gaza. But it's over 7 decades of occupation, of suppression, of oppression, of apartheid policies. And we've been having this topic under focus at the center of our discussions for the last few weeks, understandably and justifiably so, taking a look at it from various angles, various perspectives, and highlighting the different issues that relate to the situation of the Palestinian people, specifically in Gaza, and the plight of Palestinians in general. We've spoken about the politics around the issue, the economics around the issue. We've given on-ground perspective and spoken to people from the West Bank, etc. Today, our focus is going to be about the overall state of healthcare in Palestine. And if you look at the last 2 months or so, the impact on healthcare facilities in terms of what has happened in Gaza, the ethics that go with healthcare, in as far as the Palestinian situation is concerned, and the related issues. Now, let me introduce our guest to you for the program. We have Dr. Aayesha J. Soni, a medical doctor working in South Africa, as well as the vice president or vice chairperson of the Media Review Network, a Johannesburg-based advocacy group committed to human rights and justice. Aayesha, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the program.
And Jazakallah for having me.
And also with us, we've got Dr. Shuaib Manjra, a medical doctor and human rights activist. Shuaib, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Marhaban bikum.
All right, so Aayesha, let me start with you. Can we, in a broader sense, talk about the physical and the psychological trauma that specifically Palestinians in Gaza have had to deal with, not only in the last 2 months, but prior to that? We know it's the world's largest open-air concentration camp.
So I think when it comes to the situation of healthcare in Gaza, it's something that really strikes with a lot of healthcare workers. And earlier this year, before even the 7th of October, there was actually a press conference held by the World Health Organization, so WHO. They released 2 papers, so that was about in May earlier this year. And one of them was called it was Right to Health 2019 to 2021. And the second one was called Palestinian Voices 2022 to 2023. And so I think it's very poignant that this conference was held before even the 7th of October, and it focused specifically on the healthcare situation in Gaza. And what they actually found is that they documented, so all of their evidence and all of their findings is from direct evidence. It's from their healthcare workers, from their organizations on the ground. And what they documented is that Palestinians, both in Gaza and in the occupied Palestinian territories, have been undergoing systematic occupation and refugee-hood that has actually impacted their health in a significant way. So just to give you some examples, at that conference, which was hosted by Dr. Richard Peppercorn. So he's the representative for WHO for occupied Palestinian territories. He came out with the final conclusion that Israel is guilty of providing healthcare that is less than standard or on par of what Israelis receive. And like I said, just to give you some examples, between 2019 and 2021, they documented 750 healthcare-associated attacks, and this included attacks against doctors, attacks directly against healthcare workers, 315 attacks just against ambulances. And I think that speaks a lot to the fact that what has been going on against the healthcare of the Palestinians has been systematic. It has been going on. And there has been independent human rights organizations who have found them guilty of this. So I'll give you a couple of other examples, because I do think this is an emotional topic, and sometimes we can get lost in the emotions, but there's just so many facts that Israel is guilty of violating, not just so many humanitarian laws, but specifically healthcare laws. There was another report released by Amnesty International. This was in 2009 when Israel invaded Gaza for the first time under Operation Cast Lead. And again, they looked at evidence, they looked at first-hand accounts, and they came to conclusions drawn on international human rights definitions and laws. And they actually had an entire section that of Israel obstructing healthcare workers of reaching injured Palestinians. So what they would basically do, and they have accounts of this, is they would shoot at civilians, they would then be injured, and then they would prevent ambulances from actually reaching them. And any ambulance that tried to reach the Palestinians was then shot at as well. And this is how paramedics' ambulances were damaged. And so they found Israel guilty of this. They found them in direct contravention of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is that you're not allowed to obstruct healthcare workers from reaching injured people. And I think this is just in times of war or when Israel is directly targeting Gaza. But you must remember that this method and this systematic operation has been ongoing in many other ways. So, for example, the WHO also found that the fact that Palestinians have to have permits, they have to apply for permits, that their movement is restricted even when they're ill, that Palestinians who are trying to get healthcare are sometimes even interrogated and even detained. And so all of this has been documented, and I think it's really a really good demonstration of how Israel has been banging down the Palestinian healthcare in a really systematic way before even this war happened, and now this war has taken it to astronomical grounds.
So, Shuaib, on that note, I think Aayesha has been using the word systematic or systemic, and I think that fits appropriately in terms of the healthcare challenge for Palestinians, for over 7 decades of occupation. What does international law require of an occupier, and how has Israel been in violation?
So, I would look at it in terms of 3 instruments of international law which would apply. So if you look at Gaza specifically, but if you look at the broader parameters of the 7 decades of occupation, you could apply 3 different elements of international law. What we're seeing in Gaza presently, but what we've seen previously as well, is what we call the crime of genocide. The crime of genocide is governed under what is in short is called the Genocide Convention. Now, both the Genocide Convention and the Geneva Convention, particularly the 4th chapter of the Geneva Convention, all came about around 1948, 1949, after the Second World War, where we saw human devastation, where we saw genocide, we saw the Holocaust, we saw the bombing of Dresden by the Germans, where innocent people were killed, 100,000 of the population. We saw Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where you had the nuclear bomb, which was kind of decimated these 2 parts of Japan. So you had these international conventions, and people came out of the Second World War saying, look, we cannot allow this to happen again. And therefore, you had a couple of instruments with which the international community came together and kind of formulated. So the first was, as I said, the Genocide Convention. The second is the Geneva Convention, and I think Aayesha has spoken about the Geneva Convention, which has 4 different parts. The first 3 parts deal with combatants and prisoners of war, but the 4th part is, I think, relevant for us. In addition to a certain, you've got additional protocols of the Geneva Convention, which are, the first 2 are also relevant in the sense of the protection of civilians during war times. So the Geneva Convention, so the crime of genocide and the Geneva Conventions apply very much during wartime. So those are 2. The third instrument we can look at is the crimes against humanity, which can happen both during wartime and peacetime. And apartheid was one of the cases where you had crimes against humanity. So if you look at all 3, if you look at the Genocide Convention, there's genocide is defined in if a kind of condition has 3 elements to it. The first element is intent. So if you've had an intent to target, a specified population, that's critical. And we know that Israeli leaders have specifically spoke about an intent. They spoke about, every Palestinian civilian in Gaza is a target. They spoke about, Netanyahu spoke about, the biblical story about the Amalekites, where you kill every person. pregnant women, suckling women, men, women, old people, animals as well. So you can see that there was this intent from the statements of Israeli leaders. The second element to it is that you must target a specific population. And this population must either have a specific racial, religious, ethnic, or national identity. And here again, you see a manifestation of that. The third part of it is that you must inflict severe harm. And those three, I mean, there's different parts of harm. So you kill, you cause significant injury, either mental or physical injury. And the third is you make conditions unconducive to human survival. And we see that in Gaza, where you had, you stopped food and water and fuel reaching there, where you made human survival impossible. So the Genocide Convention is a critical one. And then you've got the Geneva Convention, which protects civilians, but imposes an obligation on the occupying authority to ensure that children are looked after, that they've got health care, that the innocent are protected. So in a sense, the occupying power has jurisdiction and has obligations on the occupied. Now, in terms of the United Nations and international law, and even if you consider the UK, for example, they still consider Gaza as part of an occupied territory. Mm-hmm. So Israel may have said we have withdrawn from it, but it is still considered legally as an occupied territory. So you can use various provisions, and then you've got the crimes against humanity, which are again manifold, and it's murder, it's torture, it's about forced displacement of people, it's destruction of destruction of civilian infrastructure, and you've got severe harm to people. So I think those different instruments you can use, which apply to both the war in Gaza, but more broadly to the occupation of Palestine.
All right, time for a break. When we come back, we continue the discussion with Dr. Shuaib and Dr. Aayesha. Welcome back. So we are chatting to Dr. Aayesha Soni as well as Dr. Shuaib Manjra. We're talking about the healthcare infrastructure, ethics around healthcare, international regulation around healthcare, and how that plays out for Palestinians in general and those in Gaza in specific. Central to this discussion, Aayesha, is obviously water. And under quote unquote normal circumstances, not that there are ever normal circumstances for people living in Gaza or in Palestine, what is the situation with regards to water, and what are the health complications that arise from that? And to what extent has that now been exacerbated over the last 2 months in terms of the bombardment of Gaza?
Well, I think water plays part of a much bigger problem that the Gaza population is facing and has been facing since 2008, when Hamas was democratically elected into power. Currently a medical volunteer with Gift of the Givers, and I'm sure the press statements released by Dr. Imtiaz Suleiman have been circulated widely, and they have a team on the ground, they have officers on the ground. And I think one of the things that they have really highlighted is that the access to water really has been, to the current population over the last 2 months, has really been stopped. So Israel not only cut off their water, but getting access to clean water has really been a problem. And obviously from a health perspective, we know that this can be devastating. I mean, the population's already been bombed to an extraordinary extent. And then with that comes poor hygiene, and now you don't have water resources. And so that's obviously going to exacerbate things. But I think just in the general scheme of things and looking at the bigger picture, it's not just water. I mean, I had the privilege of visiting Gaza in 2013. They had load shedding. We used to joke about it, load shedding back then. But they had restricted access to electricity at that time, and it wasn't really a time. That was a time of war. Gaza wasn't in the news. At that time, we attended the funeral of a little girl who had been shot by an Israeli tank. We visited the hospital, so I went to Al Shifa Hospital, and at that time you can see the lack of resources, the lack of basic necessities that they just need. I mean, Gaza doesn't have almost 60% of its essential medical list. And so I think it's been very, like I say, systematic, but it's really been an open air concentration camp. And this has been in regard in every aspect of the people of Gaza and just the people in occupied Palestinian territories as well. So my specific focus is healthcare, obviously, because I'm a doctor and that is where my interest lays. But it really is a human rights crisis. And We have these humanitarian laws, we have these international laws. I mean, in 2018, it was already documented that Israel had broken 80 UN resolutions, and yet there's no accountability for them. What they've been doing has just systematically been allowed to carry on. And so I do think that water is an issue, but so is healthcare, and so are a lot of other aspects. And I think what's happening at the moment and what we're seeing is actually revolutionary, and is the beginning of the end of hopefully the Zionist regime.
So, Dr. Shuaib, is there evidence to suggest that Israel is using water as a weapon? They're using access to water, quality of water, as a means to punish Palestinians?
So, there's no doubt about it. And I think Aayesha has alluded to this previously. I mean, not only in Gaza. So in Gaza, it's being used as a weapon of war. So you're depriving an entire population of water, which is essential to survival. And that's a war crime. But if you look at the West Bank, for example, Palestinians, if you compare the amount of water Palestinians use compared to the amount of water that is given to the settlers in a similar area, it's kind of manifold. So Palestinians are deprived of water on a daily basis. But more importantly, is they're not allowed to collect rainwater. They're not allowed to dig wells, or the wells are confiscated, or there's cement which is pushed into the wells, or they cannot collect water from rivers. So in a sense, water is being weaponized on a daily basis. And there's a book written about this. I can't remember the title of the book, but there's a book written about water and its importance and its weaponization against Palestinians. Now, in Gaza, Gaza is, again, on the ocean, and not only are you preventing water, you are destroying any kind of civilian infrastructure to clarify water. So, your sewer plants, all of that is being destroyed. And consequently, it's having other effects. So I was I spoke on a panel yesterday with a professor from UCT who actually teaches and works in Gaza. And he was speaking about, he showed this picture about him swimming in the ocean. And he says, well, you may ask, why is it such an important thing for me to swim in the ocean? He says, well, because of the constant bombing of the wastewater treatment plants in Gaza, all the black water is directed into the sea. So the sea becomes unswimmable. So he says, for me to swim there was a period where they managed to, kind of reconfigure the wastewater treatment plants, and again, the sea was sufficient to swim in. So that's consequences of it. Then, the other consequence is because there's a lack of potable water. He says people drink bottled water. And consequently, because of all the plastic, you got a huge pollution problem in Gaza. So aside it being a weapon of war, which is against the Geneva Convention, which is part of a genocidal war, meets the definition of genocide, because you're making the ability of people to live there impossible. And that's part of genocide. Nowhere in the world have you heard where water, food, and fuel is used as a weapon of war in the 20th century or even 21st century. So clearly, this is a weaponization. It's a war crime. It's a genocidal policy, but it also has impacts on the environment and other things, on farming, on farmlands. Now think about it. Those of us who worked in theater know the huge amounts of water you need just purely to irrigate wounds, to work in a hospital, hygiene. So now you're getting spread of infection, you're getting contaminated water. There's just a whole knock-on effect where living in a society becomes untenable without clean water.
Would you say, Shuaib, that this is one of the reasons that those who are against a so-called two-state solution, they state that if you were to go the route that many are suggesting, including the government here in South Africa that have two states, that this would be one of the challenges where Israel would use access to resources, in this case water, as a weapon to punish the Palestinians?
Oh, absolutely. The two-state solution, even if you have a two-state solution, Israel has ensured that they have all the strategic locations. So even if you look at the partition of Palestine in 1948, part of the complaint of the Palestinians when 55% of, so the Jews constituted 1/3 of the population, but were given 55% of the land. Part of the complaint was that they were given the most arable land in Palestine at that time. And since then, Israel has strategically ensured that they've occupied every strategic area, all water, sources they've taken over, all the kind of arable land they've taken over, strategic heights they've taken over. So even if you get a two-state solution, there will continue to be a dependent economy and a dependent life on Israel because they'll hold you hostage in terms of access to water, access to resources, borders, whatever have, products, getting into the occupied Palestinian territories or a Palestinian state. So even if you get a two-state solution, which to me, if you've looked at a map of Palestine at the moment, the only way you can connect some of the fragmented areas are through tunnels, because you've got either checkpoints or you've got settlements between them. There's no ways that you can have a two-state solution in terms of the configuration currently. But even if you do, you will continue to have what they call a dependent economy, an economy of Palestine which will remain dependent on Israel. And that is part of Israel's plan, that even if we grant you independence, you will have complete dependence on us. And that's what's happening in Gaza. So they say that Gaza is independent, but you've got a complete curfew that nothing can enter Gaza either through the air, through land, or through the sea. So that's a kind of similar position you would have even with a two-state solution. But having said that, even if you have a one-state solution, Palestinians will continue to be a subaltern class because they've got 70 years to catch up. They've been disenfranchised. They've been, economically, they've been devastated. Their land's been confiscated. Their capital has been denuded because of land confiscation and other things. So even if you have a one-state solution, Palestinians will continue to remain an underclass like black people in this country. So, yeah, it's a difficult challenge, but something we need to consider in terms of options you're looking at for the future.
Aayesha, just to close the discussion on this issue of water, how do Palestinians then adapt? I mean, I saw one state saying that even at times when there isn't direct conflict, over 90% of the water in Gaza is contaminated.
I must say, I don't know the exact details of how Palestinians or the people in Gaza adapt. What I can say about them is they are probably the most resilient and adaptable people that I know. Whatever they do, with all of the restrictions that they've been under, they've been able to adapt in every aspect of their lives. And it's just really, when you go there, it's just their faith is tangible. Their resilience, their spirit is really tangible, and it's like magnetic being around them. And so I don't think it's something that that we need to we need to worry about them really. And I know there's I just think they manage the situation very well.
All right, time for a break again. When we come back, the discussion continues. My guests on the program, Dr. Aayesha J. Soni and Dr. Shuaib Manjra. We're talking about the healthcare perspective to the Palestinian issue. Aayesha, we've spoken quite a bit about circumstances even prior October the 7th. Can you paint somewhat of a picture for our viewers in terms of the impact, the direct impact on healthcare facilities in terms of what has happened from October the 7th to date in Gaza in particular?
So I think what we're seeing currently in the last 2 months is unprecedented in terms of war. I don't think there has ever been in documented history such an attack on and such a devastation and ruin of the sanctity of healthcare as we are currently seeing in Gaza. We know without a doubt that the IDF and that the Zionist regime is directly targeting hospitals, and it really is in direct contravention of not only international humanitarian laws, but really human decency and basic morality. So just to give you a little bit of a picture of what's going on, about 10 days ago, there was a conference held. It was by the WHO Director General, so Dr. Ted, and he addressed the UN Security Council, and he basically gave a picture of what was going on the ground. And in that, his speech was really moving. It was devastating, the statistics he was presenting. He said that 2/3 of the hospitals in Gaza were basically only operating on very basic emergency life-saving surgeries, procedures, and that almost half of the primary healthcare centers were not operational at all. I'm sure that number has increased since then. That was actually before the time that the Zionist regime actually stormed Al Shifa Hospital, which is the largest hospital that Gaza actually has in the northern part of Gaza. And it was not only treating patients at the time, but actually a lot of people had fled there seeking sanctuary. So that's kind of been what's going on. The Zionists have been using a lot of false pretenses in order to justify what they've been doing in terms of how they've been directly targeting hospitals. They've been saying absurd things that really have no substantiated evidence, such as Hamas has tunnels under the hospitals. Hamas uses hospitals to launch their rockets from. And really, there's been no evidence of this. And this has been corroborated by international groups who are on the ground. So I think something that is very different in this war, and it's something I've been following the Palestinian struggle for a very long time. And this is really a poignant point because I've never seen it so much and so much awareness in the world, is that we're seeing what's happening in Gaza real time, and that's because of social media. So we have Palestinians in Gaza who are actually taking videos, posting it to Instagram, posting it on X, and we're able to see what's going on directly. So there really is no, or even though the Zionist propaganda machine is working overtime in the mainstream media, they really can't deny what we're seeing as it's happening. And so, for example, when we see things like an entire hospital being bombed, and then we see that was Al Ahli Hospital, that was about 3 weeks ago, and then we see the devastation, and you just see the strewn bodies of children who are basically being in smithereens. And you can't say the Zionists can't deny that, because that's what you're seeing. When you see eyewitness accounts and you're actually seeing videos of the Zionists actually going into Al Shifa, you really can't deny that either. And I think that's really a game changer in how this war has been propagated. It's never been so real time. And that's really why a lot of people who generally weren't interested in the Palestinian conflict before are now actually coming to the forefront, and especially a lot of healthcare workers, because really Israel has been targeting healthcare workers specifically, and any healthcare worker, no matter what their religious or political affiliation, can relate to how devastating that is. And you trying to do your job in order to serve a population and then being targeted by a military service. So that's just some of the examples of what has been going on. And I mean, we all know the numbers. I think it's devastating that we now reduce the number of casualties in Palestine to numbers. We really should know the names of every single child, woman, and civilian man who has been killed. But unfortunately, now we know it's 11,000, and by tomorrow it's going to be 12,000. But these are just the numbers that the Palestinian Health Ministry is able to provide us at this point. And it's probably going to be much higher in the coming days, and the reality is probably much higher as well. So just to give an overall picture, I mean, I've seen videos, and you can follow the doctors on Instagram who are actually working in Gaza's hospitals. I think they're under immense strain. Most of them are not even going home. They're working under strenuous conditions, which we as South African doctors do know, but does not even compare to what they're having to endure. And I just think that they're having to make very difficult decisions because of the resources that are so short and the sheer magnitude of the number of casualties.
Shuaib, there's been much discussion and debate around the bombing of the hospitals in Gaza, or the storming of the hospitals in Gaza. Israel is adamant that Hamas has bases underneath. There's been a lot of discussion and debate around whether that is factual or not. How do we view that? What do the facts tell us?
There's a law called Brandolini's law. Mm-hmm. Brandolini's law is also called the asymmetry principle, which basically says that the amount of energy needed to refute is an order of magnitude bigger than that needed to produce it. Mm. So basically what the Israelis would do is they would throw out nonsense, and we would spend enormous amount of time not trying to excavate their crimes, but trying to refute the nonsense. So this is kind of this asymmetry, because it takes you 2 minutes to throw nonsense out, but it'll take you 200 days to try and refute that. So that's what they've done. Any crime that the Israelis have committed, they've used Brandolini's law. They've basically used propaganda, false flag operations to try and kind of get us busy to try and refute what they've said rather than point to the crimes. So it happened at the Baptist hospital, where they bombed the Baptist hospitals. Every international body said this was not done by Hamas. They put a story out that this was a misfired rocket. Numerous media houses reconstructed what happened, and clearly it showed that this misfired rocket didn't hit the hospital. Others have said that, look, the extent of the damage, Hamas doesn't have that capacity. The rockets don't have the capacity to cause that level of damage that, the Baptist hospital where 500 people were killed. Mm-hmm. So, but the narrative was out there in the public domain, and it took people a long time to counter that narrative, because they have this whole army of trolls, and then it gets into the ecosystem, and then everybody believes it. I mean, it's a similar story to the 40 babies who were killed. I mean, everybody knows it was a false. It was fake news. But again, it took people days and weeks to try and refute that 40 babies were not beheaded. Even the president of the United States mentioned it. So there's it's constant. I mean, when they killed Shireen Abu Akleh, the same story. She was killed by Palestinians. By the time the truth comes out, that story has passed. The outrage has passed. So this is a constant story from the Israelis, who try to muddy the waters. And they say we need to investigate it, and we'll investigate it. Now simply, I mean, we need to do two things. One is take independent sources. So you take, Médecins Sans Frontières. I mean, listen to their doctors. Look at people who are working on the ground. Look at aid workers. Look at United Nations workers. I mean, the United Nations has never had so many people killed in any war zone around the world. Over 100 United Nations, volunteers or staff members were killed in this war, in this assault. Over 60 journalists. So, you listen to independent sources. Now, part of the reason that Israel is targeting journalists, they've killed over 60 journalists, probably the highest toll of journalists being killed anywhere in the world. They're bombing media houses because they don't want the truth to come out, because the truth is being told by journalists on the ground. So what do? You kill them. So the one is we listen to people on the ground who tells us what's happening. But the second is we must insist, if this is Israel's story, let's get an independent fact-finding mission on the ground immediately to investigate it. But Israel doesn't want that, because, they plant information and, they kind of take away the evidence and kind of, again, muddy the entire scene. But the third important thing is that even organizations like the BBC and Sky News are beginning to now unearth the Israeli lies around the bombing of these hospitals. The BBC did this in a very kind of definitive clip in showing how the Israelis planted the evidence and lied about the bombing of the Shifa hospital. So this is, you think about a military war, but as important as a military war is a war around a narrative. It's the war around the propaganda. And they say the first casualty of any war is the truth. And this is what the Israelis do. So, again, we need, unfortunately, we're always on a rear guard, because the Israelis throw this propaganda out, and we're trying to debunk this propaganda, spending enormous amounts of time to do it. But we've got to continually do it, ensure that we give the evidence. But importantly, we need to say, let's have an independent investigation and take this to the International Criminal Court, let them investigate these war crimes. Whether it's committed by Hamas, whether it's committed by the IDF, let an independent investigator take it and then take it to the International Criminal Court.
All right, time for a break once again before we continue the discussion, inshallah. Welcome back. We are speaking to Dr. Aayesha Soni as well as Dr. Shuaib Manjra. We're talking about the health impact of what's happening currently in Gaza, the situation that Palestinians live under all these years when it comes to over 7 decades of occupation from a healthcare perspective. Aayesha, what is now needed? I mean, look, there's been a few days of truce, some degree of medical aid being allowed through, nothing near adequate. At some point, even if this current period of bombardment and oppression and genocide comes to an end, what are we looking at as an international community in terms of medical relief and medical assistance that will be required in Gaza?
I think the needs of Gaza, the infrastructure of the healthcare that has been devastated by the current bombing is absolute. It's going to, especially in the northern part of Gaza, it's going to need a lot of help, a lot of funding. I did see over the past 4 days that there have been trucks that have been going in. There was a Qatari delegation that went into Gaza. And obviously, it's just going to need as much help as it can from all the humanitarian organizations all over the world. But and I know, as being a medical volunteer or gift of the givers, it was put on the group about how many volunteers you can get. Within 5 minutes. There were already 40 doctors who already said that they could, and that's taken into account that we don't get leave easily, and we have quite a few commitments. But that was already something, and I believe that there's already a group of 100 doctors that are ready to go. So obviously, that's how we can help. In terms of what we can do as a community, in terms of the broader perspective, and this is something that I feel quite strongly about. It's something that I've come under a lot of scrutiny with, especially at work and being a professional in an environment. But it's something that I will still always support. I think we should be unashamed in our support of the armed resistance, and that is Hamas. The Palestinians have been under occupation since 1949. It's been 75 years. There have been countless times where they've tried to peacefully. They had the Great Return March just a couple of years ago. They tried to peacefully march against Israel. Palestinians without any weapons who were unarmed were actually shot point blank. I mean, the occupation, the apartheid, the human rights violations, it's all been documented. It's all there. It's all out in the media. Everyone knows about it. And yet, even though that happens, Israel has the support of the US. At the UN, they veto all votes that go against Israel. And there really is no accountability. And so what's happened over the last 2 months, I think it's a game changer. It's shown unbelievable courage, unbelievable bravery from Hamas. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge, something that we need to see, that armed resistance under occupation is actually legal under international law. But stepping away from international law, I think we need to recognize that really when a people have been occupied for this long, really them standing up physically is the only solution. So I listened to Professor Norman Finkelstein. He's a well-known professor who's dedicated his life to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And his parents were actually prisoners in Auschwitz, so the concentration camp. He's a Jew himself. And he basically said when Hamas attacked Israel on the 7th of October, he had to take a step back and he looked at his moral compass and he said, is this justified or is this not? And he wasn't really sure how to navigate that question. But then what he did is he went back to his parents and he said, would my parents, who actually were in the concentration camp, would they have condemned what Hamas did or would they have not? And he said they would not have. Like he said, unashamed, like he knows 100%, and he went to his two siblings and he asked them that his parents would have not said that what Hamas did was wrong because they knew what it was like to live in a concentration camp. And he says that's basically what the Palestinians have been enduring for the last 75 years. And so he cannot condemn that they are actually going to now revolt against what they've been subjugated to. And so I think as a healthcare professional, I know that I became a doctor. This is what I can help. I can help with my skills. And inshallah, that is something that will happen. But in our own spaces, I think that we should just be more vocal. We should be in just supporting the Palestinians' right to exist. And at this moment, I think it's armed resistance. In my mind, I have no doubt that this is a game changer. And hopefully it is the beginning of the end of the Zionist regime because we have never seen something like this. And I do think that we should just support it in the best ways that we can. And we shouldn't be afraid of it. Even though the West has named them as terrorist organizations, we shouldn't be afraid of the repercussions because they really are standing up for the truth.
Shuaib, what kind of activism is needed now long-term from the international community, be it healthcare or otherwise? We know that this is not a situation that started on October 7th. We've been saying it and we've been emphasizing it's over 7 decades. What do we take from what's happening currently in order to guide our activism going forward? What do the Palestinians require from the international community in the long term to secure their liberation and freedom?
I mean, the first thing we need to do is ensure that there's support to Gaza that goes in. I mean, the gift of the givers, the medical aid for Palestinians are putting a call out for doctors to volunteer. So even, I mean, not even volunteer, but just show a kind of interest. So if you're interested, you go onto their platforms, and if they're taking a delegation into Gaza, then they will need you. So one is we need more volunteers to go in, particularly medical and people with life-saving skills like supporting skills, people who worked in conflict zones, people who worked with disasters, who can go and assist. The second is field hospitals. I think, with the devastation you're seeing currently, I think field hospital is probably the way to go, and kind of assist in surgery or whatever you need to do to try and build capacity as quickly as possible. The third is, Gaza's lost a lot of doctors and healthcare workers. You need to retrain them. The other important thing that we need to think about is rehabilitation services. 800 to 900 children or babies have lost their limbs. Adults have lost their limbs. So you're going to have a whole kind of, a whole cohort of people who are disabled, and rehabilitation would be useful for that. So that's what we can do immediately. In addition to providing financial resources, it's going to take 10 years to rebuild Gaza. And the hospitals, they bombed the universities, they bombed homes. 50% of Gaza is devastated in terms of infrastructure, water, sanitary services, etc. So that's one in terms of how we provide support to Gaza. The second level is we need to insist as an international and force the international community, and our government has already done that, to take Israel to the International Criminal Court and the International Court for Justice to be held for war crimes, crimes of genocide, and crimes against humanity. So we need to hold him accountable, but we also need to hold, the United States is as much part of this war, and the UK is as much part of this war as the Israelis. The Americans have provided financial support, logistical support, military arms, and people on the ground to support Israel in this. So they held equally responsible in relation to war crimes, and the UK as well, and others. So you've got to hold them accountable. But thirdly is in terms of international kind of support for Palestinians. They say outrage without action is part of privilege. So we're basically exercising our privilege. Outrage without action is privilege. So, people go and watch these YouTube clips and get angry about it, and they spend their whole day watching clips, but do nothing about it. So one is we need a greater degree of activism. Whether you're going out and marching, whether you're a social media activist, whether you're countering the nonsense that's coming from Israeli, propaganda, the Hasbara propaganda, you need to counter it. So become a warrior. What we need to do is create an international intifada. That's what we need to do, and use every opportunity to promote Palestine and to defend Palestine and to advocate for Palestine. So one is a sense of activism by everybody. The second is educate ourselves. People know little about the history, the state of Palestinians, but educate ourselves and educate other people. There's a lot of people out of there who suddenly this has triggered something and saying, okay, what's going on here? We didn't know about this. So unless we ourselves are educated, one is we cannot educate other people, who don't know about Palestine, but who are keen to know. And they don't know, not because they don't care to know, but because they haven't heard the other narrative. They go to churches and listen to the same narrative about the promised land and the chosen people and the kind of millennialist tendencies you get in many of these evangelical churches. We need to counter that through education, but educating people around us. Consumer boycotts, boycott, divestment, and sanctions is probably the most critical arm for us to do. So we need to do that as well and be part of it. So, I've seen many people, all get heated up, and there's huge consumer boycotts during a war. But once this war dies out, people begin to lose their enthusiasm for it and go back to their old habits. How do we transform mobilization for Palestine into organization for Palestine? How do we organize ourselves so that we have a greater impact rather than just this kind of, soda water effect, that when you have a war or you have a conflict, everybody gets angry and marches. 2 months down the line, when everything has simmered down, everybody goes back to sleep. How can we continue this activism for Palestine? And to me, that's the critical question every one of us has to ask ourselves.
Dr. Shuaib Manjra and Dr. Aayesha Soni, we say Jazakumullah and shukran to both of you for your time and for the very enlightening and vital input to the program. We really appreciate it.
Barakallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Viewers, until next week, keep on with the activism, keep on with the dua, keep steadfast in playing your part towards the liberation of Aqsa and Palestine. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.